I'm going to show you now how ISMS Scope document looks like and how to fill it out to be compliant with ISO 27001. Okay, before I show you the document, let me tell you a couple of key facts about this document. So first of all, this is a mandatory document, so you cannot get certified unless you have this ISMS Scope document. Second, its purpose is to define, the scope of your ISMS, which means that you define exactly what is inside your ISMS scope and what is considered to be outside of the ISMS scope. And as you will see later on, this is usually determined in terms of processes, departments, locations, and so on. And this is important because once you define it, everything that is outside of the ISMS scope is considered basically as a third party. So for example, if you're a large company and you define that only one department is within the ISMS scope, then all the other departments within your company will be considered as third parties from the ISMS perspective because you did not include them in your ISMS scope. The third thing that is important is that you should define this document typically after you define internal and external issues, meaning after you define where in your company is the most sensitive data and also what your, let's say, clients are requiring you which part of your company needs to be certified. For example, you might have a client that requires that all of your production systems are in a scope, which means that you would include a department which handles all of IT production systems. But then you might also conclude that you want to include the customer support department in the scope because it handles lots of sensitive customer data. And another thing that is important to mention here is that companies very often make a mistake that they try to exclude particular controls in the ISMS Scope document, and this should not be done here in this document. This is something that you do later on in the Statement of Applicability. Okay, let's see now how this document looks like. Okay, I'm showing you now this ISMS Scope document from Advisera's ISO 27001 documentation toolkit. And yeah, the first page is basically similar in all documents. You also have this second page with the change history and table of contents. And yeah, let me show this table of contents. So here you can actually see that the scope is typically defined in terms of departments, processes, locations. Sometimes you might have this IT infrastructure also and exclusions from the scope. So let me briefly show you how to fill this out. The first section and the second section, this is basically the structure that we follow in all documents. But when it comes to the third section, here we have to start actually describing how you want to define your scope. And here you already have the part of the text. So the following departments are included in the ISMS scope. And then you have this comment. And basically this comment provides you with a couple of options on what you can actually insert here. So basically it says that if this is a smaller company, it's better to include all the departments in the scope, or if this is a larger company, then you can specify which departments you want to include. So let me delete this comment. And then I can actually specify here, if this was a smaller company, again, you would write all the departments, but let's say that this is a larger company. So let's say that you want to include your IT operations department and customer service department. And then you would do the same for processes. You actually explain what kind of processes you have within customer service department. So there you might have, I don't know, answering to customer tickets, but also some kind of supervision processes and so on. Okay, let's see now some frequently asked questions about the ISMS Scope document. So first of all, what are the options to include or exclude from this document? Well, the standard actually did not specify what you need to include in your ISMS Scope document. So there is no really requirement to include the description of departments, processes, locations, infrastructure, or exclusions. However, this is, I would say, a good practice to have something like this. In most cases, the certification auditors will expect you to write something like this. So you might try to describe your scope in a different way. This is also okay, but I would say it's easier in the certification audit if you have this kind of a structure in the document. Also, there is an option to include a description of interfaces and dependencies here in this document. Again, this is not required by the standard, and I would suggest that smaller companies, maybe even mid-sized companies, do not write this down because this tends to be complicated, whereas larger companies might actually write these interfaces and dependencies here. Second question is, who is usually in charge of writing this document? Well, this is usually the person in charge of security in your company. So for example, CISO or the project manager, so the person who is running this ISO 27001 project. But you should also include in this decision someone from the technology side, so let's say CTO. You might even include CEO in this decision, because this also reflects basically the requirements from your customers, and this scope is basically a business decision. So it's always good to have a balance, I would say, between business side and technology side. Okay, next question: what are the typical challenges when writing the ISMS Scope document? There are several challenges when writing this document. One of them is, companies very often have a dilemma which departments to include in the scope. And as I mentioned before, if you are a smaller company, let's say up to 50 employees, it's better that you include actually the whole company in your scope, so all of your departments. But if you're a larger company, then it's better to focus only on, let's say, one department or one business unit, so that you actually don't implement the ISMS in a too large scope. So if your company has, I don't know, a couple of thousand employees, how do you really decide which departments to include? Well, you can use a couple of criteria. The first one is if your customers are actually requiring you to certify a certain part of your company. In this case, you basically follow this lead and go with what the customer requirements are. But also in parallel to this, you should actually think about, let's say, in which parts of your company do you have the most sensitive data? And then also try to include this part of the company with the most sensitive data in your ISMS scope, because of course you want to protect this data in the best possible way. The next challenge is usually with these interfaces and dependencies. So dependencies are basically ISMS scope depend on. So let's say that your whole company is in the scope. Let's say this is a smaller company, and that you have external, let's say, accounting service, right? So this means that you are depending on this accounting service for your bookkeeping. Why is this important? Because this means that you actually have to pass on certain sensitive data about your financials towards a third party. And then in the next step, you actually think about interfaces. So basically, how do you interact this third party? So you might be sending, I don't know, some information to this accountancy service through email, or you might be sending certain data through a web-based application. So in these cases, your interface between your company or your ISMS scope and this third party is email, but also this SaaS application. And basically, when you clarify these dependencies and interfaces, then it's much easier for you to define what is your scope. Another challenge for, let's say, smaller companies that are all working remotely from home is which location to enter here. And then typically you enter the location where your company is registered, so basically the seat of your company. And also another challenge for companies that have employees working remotely is what to exclude and what to include when they're using certain assets. So typically would include in the scope, let's say, the laptop, smartphones, and these things if the company owns these devices. But if the company does not own these devices, then you would exclude them from the scope. And also with regards to home offices, you would typically exclude home offices, because obviously this is something that you cannot control. So in general, anything that the company does not control directly, this is what you're excluding from the scope, which means that the usage of these assets will be regulated through agreements with third parties. And the next question is, what exactly do you have to perform before the ISMS scope document, and what you have to do after it? So as I mentioned, what you would have to do before writing this ISMS scope document is to go through the requirements of interested parties. Primarily these are your customers, but also applicable laws and regulations, and see if they actually specify what kind of scope you need for your ISMS. And after you complete this ISMS scope document, typically the next document that you would write is the top level information security policy, where you want to define what are the major intentions of your company with regards to information security. And basically you should not write this top level policy before the ISMS scope document, because before you know the scope, you cannot really tell exactly what the major intentions are. And to resolve this challenge of having too much to write, I'll show you now how to use this document wizard from Advisera's ISO 27001 documentation toolkit. Okay, this is how this application through which the toolkit is actually delivered, this is how it looks like. So basically, this is called Write Documents module within this Experta AI Copilot. and it shows your company name here. It shows the documentation toolkit name, and it also shows the name of the document that you are working on. And here in the main part of the screen, it shows you actually the preview of the document, how it looks like. And in the right hand side, it shows this document wizard. So basically, document wizard is a series of questions that AI is asking you and actually helps you fill out the document in a much quicker way. So the first question is what is the confidentiality level of this document? And it basically suggests that you can use internal use, but it also says that for the previous document, I actually used confidential as this label. So let's say that I want to use internal use. And I simply click enter, and then it asks me the next question. So who is the owner of this document? And it suggests a couple of options here: office manager, compliance manager, and so on. And basically I entered previously CISO, so I'm simply going to use this answer. So as you can see, it's very quick. You simply click what you used before, and it moves forward. Also, who is the job title of the person to approve this document? Again, I entered previously CEO. I'm going to use this answer. I move on. And what is the name of the person to approve this document? Again, I entered previously John Doe. I simply click here. And basically I completed now the wizard, and I'm going to click the download, and I'm going to download this document to my local disk on my computer. Okay, when I open the document, this is how it looks like. So again, this is the same document as I was showing you, only this time the wizard actually filled out the info that I entered through the wizard. So it inserted here this logo, because this is the logo I uploaded previously for this company, also the company name. Here, the name of the approver, the confidentiality level. Also, this is something that you'll see in the header here, the company name, the confidentiality level. And when I scroll down, you will see also that it filled out this information further in the document. So the company name and so on. So basically, when you have lots of documents, this comes in very handy, because it speeds up the writing of documents considerably. Okay, I hope this was helpful, and let me know in the comments below if you have any questions about ISMS Scope Document, and I'll help you out as soon as possible. And to see this ISMS Scope Document for yourself, click the link in the description below, and you'll be able to sign up for this free trial, which will enable you to see a free demo of this document, but also all the other documents from the toolkit. And you'll be able also to try how this document wizard works. And see also my next video that gives a detailed overview of this ISO 27001 documentation toolkit. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. And you can also subscribe to my YouTube channel not to miss any of my new videos. And I publish videos about cybersecurity governance and AI governance every week. Thanks for watching.